Hi, folks. Al Merkel here from the living room of my own house here in the valley to tell you a little bit more about my development plan. I know you all have had a lot of questions about this plan, and for those purposes, I'd like to try and give kind of a scaled, illustrated, well, it's not scaled, but illustrated demonstration of what my plan to deal with this development is. So, for purposes of this demonstration, I have drawn this kind of small scale city. It's similar to ours in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's not designed to replicate Spokane Valley, but it's similar. So, as you can see, we have two main streets here and here that have commercial zoning, well, commercial and mixed use and multifamily, basically anything that's not single family zoning around them. And by zoning, I don't necessarily, it doesn't have to be zoned this way, it's just that's what they're currently being used for. You can see that there's a few spots that still have some single family homes in some areas. And then around them, we have kind of large single family home residential areas. You can see that the main streets are controlled by traffic control devices here and here and here, and there's some traffic control devices here. But on the side streets that are in the residential areas, there's no traffic control devices. These main streets are also intended to have sidewalks, as main streets often do, whereas these side roads that are in the neighborhoods do not. So let's get a little bit into how this works. Okay, so here is that little map that we were just discussing. So what happens if a builder wants to construct a new multifamily right here? Let's target that little spot right there. Let's say there's nothing built there right now, but it's in the middle of a neighborhood, as you can see. So what would end up happening? Under our current laws, that builder would simply ask for a rezone, and he may be granted that rezone, and then he would just build right there. So what would happen? To access this, folks would have to use these side roads. So all of a sudden you would have a huge increase in traffic on these side roads without a traffic control device there. In addition, there's no sidewalks to access these things. Also, you have a school someplace in this area that, basically now has to deal with a doubling of density. Because let's say there were about 15 houses in this area, and now all of a sudden there's a new high density multifamily, so you're talking about, another 60 units. Well, that very, very effectively in this whole area, really increases demand. So right now what would happen is the builder would build, and it would be the city's job to come in and fix these roads, put in sidewalks, perhaps put in a traffic control device here, perhaps change the traffic control device at this road, all to accommodate that. Well, my plan is to make the developer pay for all of those changes if they choose to develop here. And I think that you would all agree with me that that would be very expensive. They'd have to pay for a new traffic light. They'd have to pay for sidewalks up and down these roads. They'd have to pay for school impact fees. It would be a very expensive change. Now, on the other hand, as we talked about before, these larger roads already have those high impact traffic devices. They already have sidewalks and all the rest. And if you notice, there's still some single families who live on these roads. And in my mind, it really kind of disrupts the flow of traffic. And I'm sure it's very disruptive for their lives as well. I'm sure it's very difficult for them to sell their houses to other single family homeowners because, simply nobody wants to live on Sprague or Argonne or something like that. But they're still there. We all have seen those houses on Pines. So what my plan would do is essentially make the developers pay for all these changes. But if the developers were, for instance, to look at an area that already had all of those things and perhaps consider constructing there first rather than moving out here first, that would be a much cheaper solution for that developer because they'd be able to go in, buy this property, which is essentially an undesirable property for anybody who wants a house. They'd buy this property, remove the house, go ahead and build their, new use, their multifamily or mixed use or commercial, whatever it is, without having to pay all these excess costs. So what would happen is eventually you would see that all these properties would get purchased and built on first, until this entire roadside area for all these main roads was completely used up with commercial or multifamily or appropriate things. Then eventually the demand would increase the price, and areas along these larger side roads may start to develop. But we're talking about years down the line, and this all becomes very predictable. So now, instead of having somebody build that multifamily there today where none of this stuff exists and having all of us pay for that, they would build it sometime in the future when all of this is taken care of, and they would pay for all that construction and all that buildup of those resources so that we wouldn't have to. So as you can see, we would have this kind of slow growth where first you would fill in the areas that are close to the main streets. Then eventually you would fill in the areas that are close to the side streets. You know, not represented on this map, there's a lot of obviously smaller side streets within these neighborhoods, you know, and eventually those would develop as well. But we're talking about years down the line. So this really gives us this nice, you know, if we were to draw like a growth graph, it kind of gives us this nice predictable growth line instead of what we've got right now, which is sort of like this, right? So that's kind of a summary of my plan. So I expect to see a lot of questions. Let me know, guys, if I can explain more or do more to this video. Thanks so much. Al Merkel, Al for Val, 2019, position 3. And this, of course, this video was, of course, supported by my campaign, free on YouTube. Thank you. Bye-bye.